I have noted for years that leftists are less happy than conservatives. There are unhappy conservatives. There are unhappy liberals. There are happy liberals, happy conservatives. But all leftists are unhappy. And I discovered some pieces on that in this website called Evie. So this woman is writing, she grew up Christian, then became a leftist, then became a conservative. Even though the small town feel was a bit boring, I saw a lot of people who simply were content with their lives. They loved their little family and were grateful for the abundance that came to them, and the majority of them were deeply religious. This kept families together and towns intact. When I was 13 years old, a close friend in my class was hit by a car and died. It was a devastating moment for us. I watched the religious communities rally around this family right away. They were the glue that held our small town together during that tragedy. When I compare that to all the modern feminists I used to work with and hang out with, the difference is glaringly obvious. These women were angry. They hated men. Many of them were overweight and had bad skin, and they were always finding something to complain about. Even more, nearly all of them were admittedly struggling with some kind of mental illness. Whether it was acute anxiety, bipolar disorder, or clinical depression. Many of them, I want to make sure, yes, right. Many of them would identify as liberals and seem very aware of their privilege in other respects, but appear to have no sympathy for women who fed their children differently. Okay, that's from a... Sorry, folks. My apologies. So that was one piece about mental illness, unhappiness. There was another one in Evie. Over 50% of liberal white women under 30 have a mental health issue. Are we worried yet? A 2020 Pew Research study reveals that over half of white liberal women have been diagnosed with a mental health condition at some point. Does this mean there's a correlation between progressive ideas and mental health? What if it was once a cheap shot or a personal insult? What if what was once a cheap shot or a personal insult has actually been found to bear scientific correlation between the individuals who hold progressive ideologies and an increased risk of mental illness? That's exactly what Pew Research has found, and all politics aside, the shocking diagnosis of over 50% of liberal women with some form of mental health medical diagnosis is a public health concern that no one seems to be discussing. Well, I have been discussing that because the correlation between leftism and unhappiness is a very important one. Remember, I have asked often, do the unhappy gravitate to the left, or does the left make you unhappy? And the answer is both. The study, which examined white liberals, moderates, and conservatives, both male and female, found that conservatives were far less likely to be diagnosed with mental health issues than those who identified as either liberal or even very liberal. What's more, white women suffered the worst of all. White women, ages 18 to 29, who identified as liberal, were given a mental health diagnosis from medical professionals at a rate of 56.3%, as compared to 28.4% in moderates and 27.3% in conservatives. So it isn't that you're conservative and you're mentally happier and healthier. It is that you're not a leftist, because the moderates and the conservatives had essentially the same data, same statistic, to the extent that those statistics are reliable. Progressivism demands equality for all and keeps score to an exhausting, unsustainable degree. There's also the unrelenting focus on oppression, verbal violence, and microaggressions. We know that building resiliency against hardship is the best weapon against depression and anxiety. You hear that? That's correct. That's why I have a happiness hour. That's why I speak about building resiliency so often. on a personal note, I was told by Dr. Stephen Marmer, the UCLA psychiatrist who comes on the Happiness Hour periodically, when we were discussing handling pain, he said something to me either on the air or off the air, which had a deep impact on my self-perception. And he said, "Dennis, you have very strong shock absorbers." And that's right, I thought. That's exactly what I have. I have them, and I've developed them. Everybody needs shock absorbers because life has shocks. Building resiliency against hardship is the best weapon against depression and anxiety. Yet progressive ideology forces its followers to wallow in feelings of helplessness and victimhood. Instead of empowering women and minorities with self-knowledge, strength of character, and resilience to hardship, progressivism encourages victims to stay in a place of fear and helplessness. It's not just significant that the women suffering from mental health issues are white, but especially that they're so young. The age range of those most affected was 18 to 29. There's another factor, the fear factor, no pun intended. Why do you assume that the great majority of people still wearing masks are liberal or leftist? Why do you assume that? Why were conservatives anti-mask to a much greater extent than people on the left? And the answer is fear. And you cannot be happy if you walk around in fear. It's all rooted in fear, the left. Fear of life and fear of death. But both, not just fear of death. Fear of life